King Henry is dead, but despite the loss of his son and heir, William Etheling, on the White Ship, the king secured the oaths of all his trusted nobles, including the powerful de Beaumont twins, to support his daughter, the Empress Matilda, in claiming his throne, thus securing the succession. But when another claimant steps forward, the dice are thrown once again, resulting in a 15-year-long bitter battle and in a civil war in all but name. And for the de Beaumonts of Leicester, the make or break, life and death choices that would affect both the families as well as the town's fortunes would fall to the twin brothers, Walleran and Robert. Between them, the twins would walk a political tightrope, swapping allegiances in the ongoing conflict, supporting rival claimants to the throne, sometimes simultaneously, all in a bid to maintain and hopefully extend their respective power and influence at home and abroad. Some gambles paid off, others certainly didn't. I'm Jim Butler, welcome to Casino Royale Part 4, Anarchy. Now, you may find this hard to believe, but it turns out that despite their solemn oaths to Henry I, the vast majority of the all-male English and Norman nobility weren't actually that keen on having a female ruler after all. Clearly it was okay for a woman to act as regent under the at least nominal guidance of her husband, who may be thousands of miles away on crusade, but for a woman to rule in her own right, how preposterous. I mean, the term queen itself is taken from the Saxon quen, which means king's consort, so the nobles must have reasoned, how could you have a queen without a king? Not that there wouldn't have been a king, as Matilda by this point was married to Geoffrey of Anjou, a marriage that, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, displeased all the French and all the English. So when Stephen of Blois, Matilda's cousin and self-proclaimed favourite nephew of Henry I, and the one-time passenger of the White Ship who had disembarked at the last moment due to diarrhea, dashed from France to London to claim the throne for himself, it appears that most of the English nobility were all too ready to switch their allegiance, including both the de Beaumont twins, and Stephen was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December 1135. With Walleran's extensive estates and influence in France, Stephen soon appoints him as his Lieutenant of Normandy, charged with rallying support for Stephen amongst the French nobles and defending Normandy against Matilda, her husband Geoffrey of Anjou, and their many allies. In 1137, Walleran, now considered Stephen's principal advisor, returns to England, where the king bestows favours and patronage upon him and his family, much to the annoyance of the other nobles and bishops. In retaliation, Earl Robert of Gloucester defects and joins his half-sister Matilda in France. In 1138, Walleran is rewarded further by Stephen for his ongoing service with the title Earl of Worcester. In September 1139, Robert of Gloucester returns to England, rallying Matilda's supporters, and the civil war, now referred to as the Anarchy, truly gets underway. Much of England suffered extensively during the war, with fighting and raiding causing much devastation to castles, towns, villages and farms. The fear created by the lawlessness of the Anarchy can be evidenced across the country, as villages and towns hastily erected small castles, often close to the local church, to provide protection and sanctuary for people and valuables. The remains of small castles and fortifications, like the Motte and Bailey Castle here in Cherwell in South Leicestershire, are thought to be the remnants of defences created in this chaotic period, and provide physical evidence supporting the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles claim that the Anarchy caused nothing but disturbance and wickedness and robbery. With his brother advising the king in England, Robert de Beaumont travels to Normandy in 1140 to try to hold back Geoffrey of Anjou's invasion of the province, which had already succeeded in capturing all of the duchy south of the River Seine in Walleran's absence. However, the war in England was about to get even more precarious for Stephen and his supporters. In February 1141, Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln, and it was thought that this must be the end for the king's cause. But Waleran de Beaumont escaped the battle and continued to fight for several more months from his base at Worcester. Matilda attempted to get herself crowned in London, but on the 24th of June, just before the coronation, the city rose up in support of Stephen, and Matilda and her followers fled the city, escaping just in time and hastily retreating to her stronghold at Oxford. Then, in July, as Matilda and Robert of Gloucester besieged the castle of Winchester, they were surrounded by the forces of Stephen's wife, also called Matilda. In the ensuing battle, although Empress Matilda escaped, Robert of Gloucester was captured. After Robert refused to defect to Stephen's side, the two imprisoned leaders, Stephen and Robert, were eventually exchanged in November 1141, bringing the war back to an effectual yet still bloody stalemate. But by the late summer of 1141, Waleran de Beaumont had already reconsidered his allegiance. As news reached him that his precious Norman lands were being taken over by the invading Angevin forces, Waleran surrendered to Empress Matilda. He then travelled to Normandy to the court of Geoffrey of Anjou, where his brother Earl Robert helped Waleran negotiate the return of both his English and Norman lands in exchange for serving Geoffrey and Matilda against Stephen. Soon afterwards, Robert returned to England. However, although he was still a nominal supporter of Stephen, he never actively assisted the king for the remainder of his reign. Instead, he remained on his estates, waging his own private war. Follow me. From 1141 until about 1149, Robert de Beaumont, 2nd Earl of Leicester, was engaged in a dogged battle with Ranulph II, Earl of Chester. Although much of this private conflict remains obscure, it could well have started as a result of the two powerful earls whose estates and authority overlapped here in Leicestershire since the conquest, and now finding themselves on opposing sides of the anarchy. However, this was clearly also a personal battle about territory, because even when Ranulph defected to Stephen in 1144, still this private war between the two earls raged on for another 5 years. After 2 years of negotiations between 1147 and 1149, an elaborate treaty between Leicester and Chester was agreed, in which both sides gentlemanly agreed not to destroy each other's estates, even if they did find themselves on opposing sides again. But despite this most British of stiff upper-lipped agreements, it's clear that de Beaumont had the stronger negotiating position, winning control of all of northern Leicestershire, as well as the Earl of Chester's strategically important castle here at Mount Sorrel. As well as being a humiliating blow to the Earl of Chester, the loss of Mount Sorrel to de Beaumont would have major consequences further down the line, as we'll discover later on. Another helpful consequence of this agreement between the two earls was that for the first time it mentioned some of the county's important castles by name, including Hinckley, Castle Donington, Ravenstone, Belvoir and Oakham. But Earl Robert's impressive negotiating skills were not just put to the test by the Earl of Chester. Following the death of Earl Robert of Gloucester in 1147 and the departure of Empress Matilda back to Normandy soon afterwards, it was clear the English nobles on both sides of the anarchy were becoming tired, physically and financially, with the Civil War, which had all but ground to a halt. And so Robert de Beaumont found himself leading a movement by the greater Earls of England to negotiate private treaties to establish peace in their respective areas of the country, effectively, albeit slowly, forcing the hands of Stephen and Matilda. In 1150 there was a subtle yet crucial change in Matilda's tactics. Probably around the time of his son's 17th birthday, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, made his son Henry the Duke of Normandy. This significantly elevated Henry's status amongst the noble classes and made Matilda's son the de facto opposition to Stephen's rule. Now there was a male claimant to the throne of England, one who was a direct descendant of Henry I and who now already held the title of Duke of Normandy. The following year, Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, died, leaving the young Duke to inherit all of his estates in Anjou, Maine and Touraine. However, the titles and lands weren't the most enduring gift Geoffrey left to his son and descendants. Because he had been known to favour wearing a yellow sprig of broom blossom or Plantagenista in his hat, Geoffrey acquired a nickname that would follow his family throughout history: Plantagenet. Just a year after Geoffrey Plantagenet's death, the young Duke married Eleanor of Aquitaine, which brought him the Duchy of Aquitaine, meaning Henry effectively controlled most of France. In January 1153, Henry arrived in England with a small force and with the English crown in his sights. But before he could achieve his goal, he would need the help of England's most foremost negotiator, the Earl of Leicester. With the winter weather preventing any meaningful battle between Henry and Stephen's forces, a temporary truce was agreed between the two sides, and Henry was free to travel north through the country to the Midlands. It was at Leicester Castle that the powerful Earl most likely welcomed the Duke of Normandy to his estates. The castle's Great Hall had only been built a few years earlier, with ring dating of the hall's timbers showing it was built from wood felled sometime between 1137 to 1162, making it the oldest surviving timber-framed aisled hall in the country. After a few weeks of discussions between the two, Robert decided to gamble his wealth and power and openly defected to Henry Plantagenet, at which point the Duke restored the Earl's Norman estates. In June, the Duke celebrated Pentecost in Leicester, most likely at St Mary de Castro, which still served as the castle's chapel and remained an important church in the town, despite Earl Robert suppressing the College of Canons there that his father had established in 1107. This was because in 1143, Earl Robert diverted its funds and resources to the founding of the Abbey of St Mary de Pratis, or St Mary of the Meadow, on the outskirts of the medieval town. The pious Earl was responsible for founding and patronising a number of religious establishments across Leicestershire, Northamptonshire and Warwickshire, and had already founded Garendon Abbey near Loughborough, and in time would donate to the Knights Hospitallers for the founding of a preceptory at Old Dalby. But although clearly pious, Earl Robert was also highly ambitious, and with his allegiance now fully behind the young Plantagenet, he would do everything in his power to ensure the Duke succeeded. And from this point onward, de Beaumont is constantly at Henry's side. By the summer of 1153, Duke Henry and his allies now controlled the southwest of England and the Midlands and much of the north of the country. When Stephen's troops besieged the Angevin stronghold of Wallingford in Oxfordshire, Henry surrounded the besieging forces, besieging them in return. Stephen gathered a large army with the intention of engaging in a decisive battle against Henry's troops at Wallingford, but as the two opposing armies faced each other across the River Thames, the respective barons, along with members of the church, were eager to avoid an open battle and brokered a truce, much to the annoyance of both Stephen and Henry. However, with the truce in place, the two opposing leaders, along with their leading advisors, which included the Earl of Leicester in Henry's corner, began to discuss a lasting solution. In November 1153, the two armies met again in Winchester Cathedral and ratified the terms of a permanent peace. The Treaty of Winchester stated that Stephen would remain King of England, retaining all his royal power whilst promising to listen to Henry's advice. In exchange, Stephen recognised Henry as his adopted son and rightful successor to the English throne. Stephen's son William would do homage to Henry and renounce his claim to the throne in exchange for promises of security of his lands. The numerous foreign mercenaries would be demobilised and sent home. Stephen and Henry then sealed the treaty with a kiss of peace. With the treaty signed and ratified in January 1154, Duke Henry returned to Normandy along with his new chief advisor Robert de Beaumont, who then resumed all his Norman castles and honours. Together the two allies would patiently wait for Stephen to live out the rest of his life and the succession to pass to Henry. However, with Stephen just in his late 50s and seemingly fit and well, there was no way to judge how long that would be, or even if the 50-year-old de Beaumont would live to see it. However, they say good things come to those who wait, and as it happens, Henry and Robert didn't have to wait that long at all. With his kingly authority now unopposed, Stephen launched into 1154 with a vigorous energy, extensively travelling around the country, holding courts and issuing writs, proving to the people and the barons that royal authority was once again being reasserted. However, after a busy summer, Stephen travelled to Dover to meet the Count of Flanders, and there suddenly fell ill with a stomach disease. On the 25th of October 1154, less than a year after the Treaty of Winchester gave him peace in his realm, King Stephen died at Dover Priory. Upon hearing the news of Stephen's death, Henry and Earl Robert landed in England on the 8th of December, and the Duke quickly took oaths of loyalty from the English barons. 11 days later, on the 19th of December 1154, alongside his wife Eleanor, Henry was crowned at Westminster Abbey, becoming King Henry II, the first of England's Plantagenet monarchs. As soon as Henry succeeded to the throne, Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester, took up the position that he had almost certainly negotiated with the then Duke Henry a year earlier in Leicester, the office of Chief Justiciar of England, a role that gave the Earl power over all the administration and legal processes in England, whether the king was present or absent from the realm. Like his father before him, Robert was now the foremost noble in the realm, second only to the king himself. For the next 14 years, Earl Robert held the role of Chief Justiciar of England, earning the respect of the king, his fellow nobles and learned clerics. This period of personal prosperity for the Earl also meant that Leicester prospered as works at the castle, the abbey and other projects brought trade and money into the town. Shortly before he died on the 5th of April 1168, Earl Robert was received as a canon of Leicester and shortly after was buried with great honours in the north of the high altar of this great abbey that he had founded and built. The lives of the de Beaumont twins highlights the brutally unpredictable nature of life in a medieval royal court. Although Earl Robert's gamble to support Henry saw him eventually rise to the very top of the Anglo-Norman hierarchy, his brother Waleran, despite having once been chief advisor to King Stephen, saw his power broken, following some poor political choices in France, losing his Norman lands and castles and ending his days eking a living as a mere landowner and justice in the province. He died a penniless monk at the ancestral abbey of the de Beaumont family in Normandy, almost exactly 2 years before his twin brother Robert. With the death of the second Earl of Leicester, the titles and estates now passed to Robert's eldest son, also called Robert. But with the country finally at peace and the de Beaumont family well positioned and respected at court, the future looks prosperous for both the town of Leicester and the new Earl. But Lady Fate had other ideas. Join me soon for Casino Royale Part 5, Rebellion. Thanks for watching.